Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro. As Chris said, I'm Nick Smith, Regional Director for UK and Europe, and I'm going to start with an apology. For those who may have been tracking the program over the last couple of weeks, I wasn't meant to be speaking today. It was going to be my colleague, Justin Keller, and for those who might know Justin, you'll know I am not Justin. And I found out about, I want to say a little over 48 hours ago, he wasn't going to be able to make it, so I'm going to try and fill in as best I can, to be honest, I think it's going to be a voyage of discovery for all of us as we go through this. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say yet, but hopefully something will come together. But I offer that not as an excuse, well, partly as an excuse, but also because I don't want my lack of preparation to reflect in any way just on the high esteem that we hold this conference in. Melanie earlier on talked about the fact that some years ago it was done over in the other conference room, and I remember that well. I did a couple of those at least, I think, in those big comfy chairs. And to see where it's come today is quite amazing, really. And in fact, when I arrived yesterday, I was in the immigration line, which, after I'd stopped getting angry about the fact that I now have to stand in a long immigration line as I come into European countries, because Brexit still hurts. Despite that, I then was talking to some of my colleagues who actually recognized that this now has become one of the most important conferences, and I wouldn't even say in Europe now, I'd say globally, and that's because of the hard work of the team that pulls this together, the gracious hosting of all the team, and of course, Melanie and her team who pulled this together. So I just want to say how delighted we are to be involved in this conference again, and even more delighted to host the reception, which clearly we feel is very important, and hopefully get a chance to see most of you there. So apparently, Justin was going to talk about connecting the future warfighter. So that's what I will try and do, is try and talk about that. And there are some elements of technology that Justin was very keen to talk about, and I will try and get to those at some point, but we'll go on something of a journey as we try and get there. Chris talked about this sort of battlefield of the future, and it's interesting because when we talk about the future warfighter, that's kind of what you're trying to think about, is what is that going to be the context, the operational context they're going to be operating in. And a lot of the stuff here, this for me is kind of that tactical view of that context, especially from a space perspective of what's going on. And a lot of this is familiar, and this is an older report, and a lot of this is still valid, but it's moving on. And quite frankly, I don't want to go into detail on this because, again, just another plug, absolutely come listen to Clint Clark later, because he'll bring this to life in a way that I just can't, and really start talking about some of these things. But this is kind of the operational context that the space domain is operating in right now. And the other reason I don't want to get into too much detail is because there is the Russian hacking group Fancy Bear, and I don't know how I just want to get fixated on trying to work out why it's called Fancy Bear. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but there are a few things I think we can take away from this. One of them is the old adage that somehow distance was mitigation against the threat no longer exists. Things like proliferation as a mitigation against these threats no longer really as a mitigation that we think it is. So a lot of things I think we thought meant that space was safe no longer means it's safe. And we've heard that from the talks already and what it means through. And you've heard it from other talks from some of my colleagues from Lockheed Martin. So the question is, what is Lockheed Martin doing in response to that? Well, actually what we've done is we've done a lot of thinking. We've done a lot of modeling. We've done a lot of wargaming. We spent about the last 2 decades really thinking about what it means to build some of these resilient space systems and space architectures. It's led to development of some specific technologies. You won't be surprised to think that we're already talking about how you do augmentation of systems when they're already in orbit. That's not just on the software side, but also think about how do you upgrade the hardware on these systems. People may have seen a demonstration we did a couple of years ago called Linus, which actually was remote proximity operations using CubeSats at GEO. And that was really starting to think about how you might be able to augment some of these systems in the future as well. But the other thing that came out of all this kind of thinking was, in fact, that actually it's as much about the con-amp, the con-use, the con-ops of these systems, and how you start building out these architectures, and how actually you don't get fixated on the platform or the satellite or how much anti-jam you have on the satellite itself, but you focus on the mission. You focus on what it is you have to do and for the period of time you have to do it in. And when you take that mission approach, you start coming up with some different solutions, and you move away from just this fixation on purely just a space segment solution, but on a far more holistic view about how you start making sure that when a commander wants to be able to run some kind of mission, they have confidence that these systems will be there. And I think it's worth just remembering that sometimes, again, we get slightly fixated on, will these threats really happen? What's the likelihood of that? The reality is, some of the threats we're seeing are having an impact because people are making different decisions about how they're going to run operations or different decisions about the capabilities they're going to buy. So this thing is already having an impact. And it becomes about how can you drive confidence into the operational community that these systems will be available for the mission when they need it. It doesn't matter if it's 99.9% availability. If it's unavailable when they need it, that's a challenge. But then I want to zoom out a little bit as well. I've talked a little about the space, that space operational tactical context. The other thing we're hearing as well is there's just this other sort of more grand challenge that many customers and many nations are facing right now, which is, okay, for a while we had this technical advantage, but actually that technical advantage is starting to diminish. We're starting to see that actually some of our adversaries, their R&D funding is going much further than our own R&D funding. So that technology advantage the gap is just closing. So how do we start to counter that? Because the reality is, when we go into the next campaign, it's likely that it doesn't matter how good the stuff is at the start of the campaign, it's going to be how quickly can you innovate and replenish and replace through a protracted campaign. And that takes a different kind of mindset. So we've been thinking as a company about what role can we take in that, and where can we bring and really add value into that. And this is what's been driving us as a corporation across all our different divisions for the last few years. It's this concept of 21st century security. At a basic level, it's really thinking about how do you start interconnecting all these different platforms. That's one level, and it's one that people probably latch onto, and it's kind of some of the things that most of us in the defense world have been hearing for some time and been trying to do for some time. But it's a little bit more advanced than that, because it's a recognition that we like to think of ourselves, well, we know we're the world's largest defense contractor. We like to think of ourselves as one of the world's best system integrators. So how do we come into this game and start thinking about our knowledge of the defense enterprises, the knowledge of the platforms? How do we start bringing technologies and commercial solutions into bringing connections together, and not just connecting these different platforms, but thinking about how you prosecute those missions in the future? And that means how do you start changing intent into military effect, and you close that gap as much as possible. I'll come on some of the more commercial elements of what we're trying to implement through 21st century security at the end, but some of the technology areas that we're focusing on, and one of them I'll just hone in on, are up on the board there, and I think they're kind of aligned with what most people would expect. But the one I really want to focus on, because it's relevant to what we're talking about here, is the advanced communications and 5G.mil. 5G.mil really is how do we, as a corporation, start leveraging that 5G advantage, the benefits that come with the 5G solution, as part of this interconnected network, but put an assured wrap around it. So the 5G is how do we partner with commercial, who do this incredibly well, and the .mil is the Lockheed Martin part of that. How do we then start making that technology applicable to some of these very complex scenarios? And there's one of those wonderful pictures that shows all these things connecting beautifully. But how do we try and do that? So we put a lot of thought into trying to bring that together, because the 5G.mil concept, when we look at 21st century security, is going to be fundamental to that interconnectedness. What's happening now is, we've been doing this for a few years, we're starting to actually realize some real results and some tangible results. Early this year, we actually had a terrestrial node in an AOR actually putting a 5G, a standalone 5G network in a small AOR area for the US Marine Corps. And that was connecting all the terrestrial systems operating there and the UAS operating there, and interconnected them with an assured 5G network. So we're actually starting to realize some of this technology now. And we feel it's world-leading technology. But the next step then, that's terrestrial. How do we start putting that into space? Because when you start looking at this overall network, clearly space is going to be a fundamental part of that. And that's where actually we're starting to, or we're about to launch a 5G payload on a demonstration satellite that we've funded ourselves. And that's taking all that kind of investment that I've just been talking about, and then putting that into kind of a space application. We've actually done the demonstration in the lab on this and created a full 5G network, and we've actually done the connections into lots of different 5G terminals as well, and proven the transmission of video and data and all those things that you would need to do down into small 5G devices as well. So we've proven the technology works. It's all in space-hardened technology. The next step now is we're going to launch it. And actually, the reason it hasn't launched yet is because we're waiting for that launch slot. Just the standard space of where the launch world is right now. So it's not the technology isn't ready. It's just we're trying to get ourselves onto the next launch we could do. When that goes up, that will then start plugging that gap in that overall 5G.mil network that I talked about and will be an integral part of it. But what's also fascinating about this is, as we've started talking about this with a number of commercial operators and people thinking about how they're going to get into that multi-orbit kind of hybrid architecture we've been hearing about, this actually is of real interest in them as well, because although we've been developing with very much that defense and 5G.mil network in mind, the fundamental technology, of course, is applicable to many of these applications. And I talked about, Justin wanted to make sure I labored one point. This is one of the things he asked me to do, was talk about just make people aware of the work we're doing around this technology and just how advanced we are in maturing this technology as well. And hopefully, within a couple of months, we'll see this on orbit in our TACSAT platform. I said there was some other elements to 21st century security as well, and this actually brings me kind of full circle back to our involvement in this conference as well. Talked about the technology elements quite a lot, and that's the thing that people latch onto very easily. But something our CEO, Jim Takelett, talks around a lot is anti-fragility. It's loosely based on some of the work that came out of Nassim Taleb's book, which was Anti-Fragile, and it talks about the notion of trying to build a level of strength into systems. We often talk about industrial resilience, and it's something that people are talking about when they think about how do you make sure you have that industrial capacity that responds to some of these black swan events in the future. This is slightly different because resilience really talks about how you bounce back from some of those shocks. Anti-fragility is more about how do you build the strength in from the outset, and how do you start thickening some of the system elements that you're going to need to make sure that when these things happen, you're able to resist them from the outset. This really came to a head for us through COVID and clearly through Ukraine, where actually we were struggling to deliver certain systems, not because we weren't able to, it's because the supply chains were so weak and so thin. And that actually started manifesting itself in how quickly some things came out. And that wasn't just us. If anyone listened to the previous head of the Space Development Agency talking about some of the delays with the Tranche 1 tracking layer, that also was down to fragility in the supply chain. Now, part of that's going to be a policy response and how well do nations start thinking about how they invest in their broader industrial bases, and some of that's been discussed earlier today. But we also recognize that as a prime, we have a role in that as well. And one of the things we're trying to do through 21st century security is how do we start taking our place and investing in that supply chain? Some of the things we're doing is when we talk about these networks, including 5G.mil, is what strategic agreements do we need in place? What partners do we bring in? On one level, we've got sort of strong, large partners like Intel and Verizon who are helping that. But for that 5G.mil space payload that I talked about, we've actually used a small SME in the UK to deliver part of the technology in that. We recognize that the way you do this is you find the best in class around the world, and you invest in it, you partner with them, and get a chance to grow. And that way, not only will we build that sort of strength we need in the supply chain, the industrial base, to respond to some of these threats in the future, but we as a company will benefit because we'll have more options to be able to go to. So actually, it's a win-win for everyone, and it's an integral part of what we're trying to do with some of the commercial aspects of 21st century security. And as I said, it kind of does the full circle and comes back to why we're here. Because if anything that I've just said piques your interest, or if there's anything else you want to come talk to us about, that's why we come to these things. Because we all recognize that collaboration is going to be important for us to try and solve some of the challenges that we've all discussed today. So I would just say, please come find me, have a chat. I would love to meet as many people as I can do. If you can't get me sort of through the lunch things, then please come and grab me at the reception that we are delighted to be sponsoring later on this evening. I wish you all a good rest of the conference, and I hope to meet many of you later. Thank you.